Morning. Today's sermon is on the topic of being a faith-at-home dad. And since I've only now been a dad for just barely 2 years, I got a special treat for you today. This is my dad of 31 years now, I guess, getting up there in age. His name's Frank Dodson, and if you don't know my dad, let me just introduce him to you a little bit. My dad has been in the ministry for over 30 years now. He was the campus minister at UNC Chapel Hill for 22 years. I was raised on campus at Carolina. We actually lived in the same apartment as Carolina students for a little bit of my life. So I was able to see him in ministry through that. After 22 years, he decided that he was now too old to hang out with college students all the time, and that was true. So he decided to take a job at Mid-Atlantic Christian University and hang out with more college students. He was a professor there and the librarian there for 7 years at the Bible College. And more recently, he's now back with Campus Christian Fellowship as their executive director. He travels around the state, raises money for that ministry, is kind of a mentor to the ministers that they have on ECU, NC State, UNC Chapel Hill, and UNC Wilmington. They have a ministry on all of those campuses. So that's what he's doing now. I've always thought of my dad as a really intelligent, smart person. He has 2 master's degrees, so he's smarter than me, at least according to those pieces of paper. He's smarter than me. But I've always felt like I've got some big shoes to fill in the ministry. Dad's been doing it for so long, and he's well known around the state because of what he does. And I think that was one of the reasons why, straight out of high school, I didn't want to go into the ministry. You know, I kind of wanted to be Dustin, you know, and I had my own hopes and dreams, and I went to East Carolina and did good in school there and got my own job, and, you know, the Lord had different plans, the same plans that I knew he had all along. You know, I was just trying to avoid, and it's definitely because of the influence of him that I'm here before you. So I don't know what kind of dad that you have or that you had, but I can definitely say that I have a great dad. This is a picture of me on one of our beach trips when I was young, maybe a little bit older than Caden. And it just reminds me of him, you know, sitting there playing on a playground, those sort of things. Mom sent some pictures, so if your mom sends a picture, you got to put it on the screen. You can't leave it out. So that's a picture of me as a child, and he's going to share some stories with you of me as a child too, I'm sure. Dad was doing Faith at Home. You know, we're in this Faith at Home series. Dad was doing that before there was even a program called Faith at Home. And the reason he was doing it is because he knows what God's Word says about fathers and their role in the spiritual development of their children. He did a great job with that. Maybe you had a different experience with your dad. Maybe your dad was there, but he was never really a spiritual impact on you. Maybe your mom did that. Your mom took you to church, but your dad wasn't really a spiritual type person. Maybe your dad wasn't there at all when you were growing up. I definitely don't take for granted having my father there because I work with young people and I see some of the families that they come from. And I know it's a blessing to have him. But no matter where you sit on that spectrum, I think there's a decision for you to make today as a father, as a future father one day. You have 2 choices. If you had a dad who was a great spiritual influence on your life, who raised you in the faith, who trained you, you have a choice to make today to continue that trend, to make sure that your family, that your children have the same upbringing, maybe even do it a little bit better than your dad did. If you're on the other end of that spectrum and you didn't have a father that was a spiritual influence in your life or he wasn't there at all, you have an even more important decision to make. And that's to change that trend, all right? Start a new trend to say, my children are going to be raised God's way. And it's not just a decision that's going to affect you and your children. As we're learning at Faith at Home, it's going to be for your children's children, your great-grandchildren. Hopefully the things that you start with your children will be passed on from generation to generation. So I hope and pray that you make one of those 2 choices today if you're a father. I want you to realize before we start, I'm going to be bragging on my dad a lot because he did a great job. But I want you to realize that we are far from perfect, okay? I'm sure he's going to tell some stories about me that are going to make you realize very quickly I'm far from perfect, all right? And I'm going to try to come up with some stories about him to show you that too. But as we're talking about Faith at Home, I thought about this week. I never really thought about it. My family, Faith at Home. I realized my grandfather Dodson, his dad, was a preacher. My father Frank is a preacher. His oldest son, Dustin, is a preacher. My little brother, Daniel, is a preacher. All right? Now, I know that sets up for my son, Caden, to be a wild child, right, and go off the deep end and do whatever he wants. But seriously, we're not perfect, but there's no denying that there's something happening in my family, especially with the men, that creates an environment for spiritual growth, for training, for a faith that's passed on from generation to generation. I hope that all of the men here especially, but everybody here can learn something from God's Word today about what it takes to be a faith-at-home dad. So let's get started with that.
Hey, it's great to be here with you today. We're going to be talking about affirming words in a minute, but if it's okay, could I tell a story about Dustin? Is it okay if I do that first? No. All right. Okay. Just one story.
All right.
There are many. Maybe I'll tell two. But we lived in the Chapel Hill area for 22 years when Dustin was growing up. And for 7 of those years, we lived in the little town of Carborough, which is right next to Chapel Hill. Dustin had met a friend at school that he wanted to get together with one Saturday, I think it was, and play at his house. So we thought that would be a good idea. But after a couple hours, we received a phone call. And it went something like this: are you Dustin Dodson's father? And it was the Carborough Fire Department calling us. And it seems that Dustin and his friend had found some matches. I don't know if they were trying to start a campfire or whatever, but things got out of control. And when we arrived at the crime scene in Carborough, lots of fire trucks, police cars. We tried to use affirming words with Dustin at that occasion. I think we said something like, "Wow, Dustin, it's good that you only burned down 1 or 2 acres. That's good." Or maybe we said something like, "Well, it's really good that you've called the fire department so quickly. You saved Carborough." And if you believe that that's what we said, I've got some swampland I want to talk to you about. But really, at that point in the situation, there was really no need to yell and scream at Dustin because the policeman had scared him enough to teach him a real lesson. That doesn't mean that there was not appropriate discipline and punishment. I'm not sure what it was, but it was appropriate, I'm sure. But a faith-at-home dad should use affirming words with their kids. 2 verses of Scripture talk to us about this because words are so important, dads. Words that we say to our kids are very, very important. Proverbs 12:18 says, "Reckless words pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." And then a quick little verse in Ephesians 6:4 says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children," which means do not irritate them or annoy them to the point of anger. There's a really neat guy that I've really just learned about in the last week or so named Bill Glass. Bill Glass is a former NFL football player, and he was on a championship team which was the Cleveland Browns. So you know that Bill Glass is really old, right, if you're a football fan. Back in the 60s, I think. But anyway, after football, he went into prison ministry. Was a minister, did a lot of prison ministry. He tells of a time when he was with several hundred inmates in a gathering, and he decided to ask them a question. He said, "How many of you as children were told that one day you're going to end up in prison?" And almost every hand went up in that crowd of inmates. After 50 years of ministry, Bill Glass, and much of that in prisons, he believes that most people, especially who get in trouble, suffer from a father problem. Reckless words maybe were spoken to them. Maybe they were exasperated children. Maybe fathers were absent in their lives instead of being dads who use affirming words. Folks, there's so many voices in the world today that are telling our kids that they don't measure up in some way or another. As dads, we need to use every avenue that we have to use affirming words with our kids, especially when they're young. But it doesn't end there. We should use affirming words with our kids throughout their lives. Too many dads only speak to their kids when their children have done something wrong. Now you might be saying, what affirming words? What does that mean? How do I do that? It's really not that hard. Affirming words can be things like, good job, or I'm proud of you, or your throwing arm is really improving. And by the way, playing catch with your child, great time to talk with them and open some communication along with affirming words. Maybe you could say after a certain situation, wow, you really handled your anger very well in that situation. And then there's those three famous words, I love you. I love you. Our kids need to hear that, even though it's kind of hard for guys sometimes to say those words. I'll confess that I had trouble saying those words for a long time. I was raised in a Christian home, a home that I knew I was loved in, but my parents didn't say I love you very much. And when I was older, I asked my mom, why was that? Why didn't we say those words? And she said it was because of her own experience in coming up, and that people around her when she was young would say that just kind of flippantly, but they really didn't mean it, or they didn't show it in their actions. I regret not saying those three words with my kids more. I hope they felt loved, even though I failed to say it enough. So I love you, son. Okay. But there are other things we can do to affirm our children. You can leave them notes. Maybe in the morning when they get up to go to school, there's a note on their mirror that affirms them. One thing we always need to do is make sure we don't talk badly about our kids in public, like I just did with Dustin a few minutes ago. But, you don't have to say, well, you can't believe what Dustin did last week, and then you tell the story, try to outdo some other father about your kid. Don't do that. Don't embarrass your child in public. Be specific with the praise that you give your child. Dad's words are so important with our kids. Decide today to use or not to use words that pierce the spirit of your kids like a sword, but instead use wise, affirming words that bring healing.
All right, so the second point today in the sermon is active involvement. All right, a faith-at-home dad needs to be actively involved in every aspect of their children's lives, not just some areas of their children's lives, and then not involved in others. Since Dad decided to tell a story on me this morning, now this isn't in my notes, but I'm going to tell a story on him. Dad was always very actively involved in my brother and I's lives. Being a minister, especially with college students, he was busy nights and weekends because that's when college students were free. So he was gone a lot during those times, but he would always take us with him. You know, I'd be in his office, or I'd be at the church service, or I'd be on the trip with the students as a child. But I remember this one time, Dad decided to take me and my best friend at the time fishing. And if you know me, I love to fish. And this friend's name was Lee. And to me, Lee was probably the coolest kid because he was funny and a good time to be with. But as an adult, Lee was probably the most annoying kid you could think of, okay, because he was always getting in trouble. He's always running his mouth, talking, just, one of those really boisterous out there kids. So Dad takes me and Lee fishing. It was at Park Springs Christian Camp, almost up in Danville, Virginia. We get there, beautiful lake, getting ready to fish. We're getting our fishing poles out of the back of the car, and Lee, just being wild and not paying attention like usual, grabs his fishing pole, is whipping it around everywhere, and hooks my dad in the back of the head, okay? Right there behind the car. It just whacks him right in the head, okay? And Lee doesn't know he's got my dad hooked, so he's going, come on, what's my pole hooked on? Like yanking it, okay? Now, I did not see my father get angry very many times in my life, okay? This was one of those times that he did, all right? I just remember him whipping around, and he grabs that hook and yanks it out of his head and is holding it in his hand. And he just says, Lee, pay attention to what you're doing, son. And we were in shock because he never raised his voice like that, okay? And we just froze. And he just takes a second, He turns around, walks around the corner of the building. And now I don't know what he said when he got around the corner of the building, okay? I can't speak for that. But, a couple minutes later, we're sitting here thinking the fishing trip's over. We're getting ready to go home. Comes back around the building, kind of regained his composure, and he said, let's be a little more careful. Let's go fishing, all right? And he took us fishing. So in that moment where he could have just blasted into my friend, I'm sure over the years he wanted to tell my friend off so many times, he was still able to keep his composure and not necessarily use affirming words, but not use words that would hurt his relationship with that young man in any way. I heard a story one time about a girl named Sarah, little elementary school girl, and in our art class at school, she was supposed to make a plate that represented her family. Okay, so they give Sarah this plate and they say, draw your family on this plate. So in the background, it's kind of like a farm scene with like a sun up top, a typical picture that kids would draw. First thing she draws is her mother. Her mother's beautiful. Draws her sitting there on the hill. Second thing that she draws is herself under her mother's arm. All right, and the third thing that she draws is the family dog right there in the picture, okay? She takes the plate home, shows her mother. She's so excited, and her mother just gasps and says, where's your dad? See, Sarah's family was dad, mom, her, and dog. And she had left her dad off of the plate. So her mom's like, we can't put this in the house. We can't even show your dad this. Well, the dad found out about the plate. And it made him realize, I'm here. I'm in this family, but I'm not necessarily here. He was always away on business, or he was always busy providing for his family. And providing for your family is important. Don't get me wrong. But if it's at the sake of a relationship with your kids, it's not that important. And it really caused that dad to realize, man, I've got to, even if I can't quit my job, I've got to make sure that I make the most of the time that I do have with her. And it really impacted him. Maybe your situation is not that extreme. Okay, maybe you are actively involved in the lives of your kids, but you're only actively involved in certain areas. Areas that you're comfortable with. Yeah, I'm involved in that, but then if you get a little uncomfortable, you're kind of like, I'll let mom handle that, or I'll let somebody else handle that. Okay, and typically what we see, or at least what I see, even in myself, we got a lot of dads who want to coach and train their kids in sports, right? Like, I'm so excited about Caden getting on to play sports so I can work with him, on his toss and all these things and hitting and all these things. We got a lot of dads that are like, yes, I want to coach my kids. I want to train them. We're going to work at home. We're going to be away on weekends playing. We're going to, in all these tournaments, we're going to do a lot of stuff. But then when it comes to coaching and training our kids spiritually, those same dads are kind of like, mom can handle that, or we'll take them to church. All right? That's not how God designed it to be. And don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-sports. I played sports growing up. My brother and I both did. But there was always more of an emphasis put on our spiritual training and our spiritual growth than our athletic growth. And here's a hard truth. It's true, but it's hard to even say. But if dads today spend as much time, energy, effort, fill in the blank, on coaching and training our kids in the faith as we do coaching and training them in sports, our kids would be so much better off. And we'd have a faith that would last and be passed on from generation to generation. And you can fill in the blank there with whatever you want. Maybe it's academics in your family. Maybe your child, you're always pushing them to get straight A's and get that scholarship, and you want them to be a class ahead. But then when it comes to spirituality, you're kind of like, somebody else can handle that, or we don't necessarily talk about it a lot. Joshua, verse 24, says it way better than I can say it. Joshua's speaking to a group of people who have kind of been distracted by other things, kind of like we do sometimes as parents. This is what he said. He kind of challenges them. He says, but if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your forefathers served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. You see, Joshua was saying, you guys have a choice. You can either spend your time with your kids, your family, training them, teaching them about the gods that your forefathers, the one true God, teaching them about him, or you can spend your time teaching your kids and worshiping the gods of the culture. whatever those may be. And he says, but for me and my household, we're serving the Lord first. You know, there's a huge lie out there that I think Satan wants parents to believe, and myself included, is that your kids will figure this God thing out on their own as long as you have them in church. Okay? As long as they're here Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, you know, they'll be able to get through this thing we call life, and they'll have a faith that lasts. And that's a lie. You know, unless the things that are being taught at church are being reinforced at home, and the things that are being taught at home are being reinforced at church, we're going to continue to see young people walk away from the faith. You have to be actively involved as a father in your children's lives to make things really take hold and to make things last.
A story that wasn't in your notes, huh? Okay. I'll tell another story. Not too long after Dustin's run-in with the fire department, we moved from Carborough. We weren't kicked out, but we moved from Carborough in 1994 to a house outside of Carborough, outside of Chapel Hill. So it had been a long time since we had seen our neighbors, the Weatherlys, who lived next door. And things happened while we were in Carborough to the Weatherlys' property. Seems like one time their cedar trees, some limbs got cut out of them, and there was like a little tree house up there that somebody made. Dustin's brother broke one of their windows in one of their cars, and who knows what else happened during those 7 years. But when we moved back to the Chapel Hill area in 2011, we hadn't really seen the Weatherlys since 1994. And you know, they were elderly or somewhat elderly when we lived there. So Debbie and I just happened to run across them at a restaurant in 2011, and we said, "Are those the Weatherlys over there? You know, our neighbors?" And we were kind of like, you know, I don't know if we should go talk to them or not. But we did. We went over and sat down with them, reminded them who we were, and I remember saying to them, you know, I know our boys probably irritated you all some through the years, but I want you to know they're both in the ministry. And they didn't act surprised at all. They thought that was just great, and that they weren't surprised that our guys turned out that way. Dustin was really not a bad boy. He was a good kid, just a boy sometimes. And he grew to love the Lord at an early age. We're proud of what he's doing, proud of who he is. We're proud that he is a spiritual leader in this church and with the youth here and in his own home. And we love what you're doing. We love you, son. But a faith-at-home dad needs to be a spiritual leader. He needs to be a spiritual leader. Sometimes that's hard for dads. Sometimes they feel that they don't measure up, or they don't really know how to do that, or what it takes to do that. But one thing is clear, that the scriptures say that fathers are to be the spiritual leaders of their home and of their children. There's a couple of verses in Malachi that are really intriguing to me, interesting to me. Malachi, of course, is the last book in the Old Testament. These are the last two verses in the Old Testament that are on the screen, Malachi 4, 5, and 6. Now, think about the entire Old Testament. Think about all that God did through those many, many years with creation and Abraham and Moses, the Exodus, the Promised Land, the kings, the prophets, the captivities, the coming back from captivity, all those things that the Old Testament talks about. What would you think God would end the Old Testament with? What would he say last in the Old Testament? Well, these are the verses that he chose to be at the end of the Old Testament. And they read like this: "See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, and the hearts of children to their fathers, or else I will come and strike the land with total desolation." I don't know exactly what all those verses mean, because they're prophecy. You know, there's some things there that I don't really fully understand. But it's clear that the last verse of the Old Testament is talking about relationships between fathers and children. It's clear from Luke chapter 1, verse 17, when the angel speaks to Zechariah, that the coming of John the Baptist and the coming of Jesus were fulfillments of these verses in Malachi. That John the Baptist coming to preach repentance and change people's lives, and Jesus coming to give grace to people and to offer forgiveness to dads and everybody else, was a fulfillment of these last verses of the Old Testament. So just think about that. Just think about that. The last verses of the Old Testament, the promises that were coming in the future were about fathers and their children. I think that's very, very significant. It tells us that maybe fathers and children's relationships were a little strained during Malachi's times, and restoration was needed. But the verses tell us that God, one of the reasons God sent his son to this earth was to help restore that relationship between dads and their children. Dads, I want to offer 4 ways to help you be spiritual leaders of your kids. And you need to try these things if you haven't, and make sure you do them in the presence of your kids so they can see you doing these things. 4 things. The first one is teach respect. Teach respect for God in the way that you pray and in the way that you speak. Teach your sons respect for women in the way that you treat their mother. Teach respect for others in the way that you deal with people around you and how you serve the people around you. Number 2, model grace. Realize that you have been saved by grace, by the grace of God through Jesus Christ, in spite of who you were. Then make sure you're not just being a male with ego, but you're being a man who shows others the grace that you have been shown. Number 3, share your faith. This might seem really hard for a lot of guys. Share your faith with your kids. You don't have to know everything in the Bible to do this. You know, a lot of times guys think, I don't know that much about the Bible. You know, I'm not a great teacher. I'm not the best teacher in the world. Maybe somebody else can do this for me. But you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have all knowledge to do this. How hard is it to sit down and read the Bible with your kids, or Bible stories with your kids? That's not hard. How hard is it to tell your story about your life and what Jesus has done in your life for you? That's not that hard. Number 4, protect your family spiritually. As dads, as spiritual leaders in the home, dads are to be on the lookout. You know, they're to be watching to see what's going on spiritually in their families, with their spouse, with their kids. And sometimes you need to act, and you need to, when you see things, you need to act and make things different. You might need to get rid of some channels on the TV, or make sure you use parental controls. You might need to control computer use in your home. Sometimes you might need to tell your kids you're going to start monitoring their phones because you see things that will harm them spiritually. Sometimes you have to appropriately say no when you know something's not good for your kids spiritually, and you explain to them why you're doing that. We looked at a verse earlier from Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, but the complete verse is on the screen now. Fathers, do not exasperate your children, but instead bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. These 4 things that I've offered you might seem kind of hard to do, but I challenge you to do something with them, okay? Maybe just work on 1 or 2 of them for the next month, and then work on the other ones the following month. Remember, they're teach respect, model grace, share your faith, protect your family spiritually. A faith-at-home father needs to be a spiritual leader. Remember what Malachi said. Jesus came to help you dads be spiritual leaders of your kids. What are you going to do with that?
All right, so as we close this message out, I kind of have a challenge for the men in here. Whether you're a father now, whether you'll be a father one day, whether you're an uncle, whatever it may be, here's the challenge for us. After hearing all of this stuff as a father, you might say, yeah, but when am I going to do all these things? I hadn't done it up to this point. How do I all of a sudden start doing that? Let me just give you 3 times that from my time with my father and my time with my son that have worked for us. Number 1 is mealtime. Excellent opportunity to do something spiritual with your kids. Number 2 is bedtime. Right before bed, most of the time your family is there. You can do something with your kids. Number 3 is when you're traveling. All right, you're all in the car. You're going to wherever, to the beach. It's a good time to spend some spiritual time with your kids. With Caden, he's just turned 2. Every night, I take him in his bedroom, sit in a chair, and we read this little Bible story book. We've got the whole series of Bible story books, and we sit there and we read that together with him. And he loves it. Like, he looks so forward to it. Sometimes, even if Lexi's got him, he'll come running out there and say, Daddy, because he wants me to do it with him, because I've always done it with him. So I'll take him into the bedroom. We'll read this Bible story. His favorite one is David and Goliath. All right, he loves David and Goliath. He can point out the sling, the harp, the rock that hit Goliath. Oh, he falls down. He can do everything with that story. And every night he wants to read David and Goliath. But the truth is, the biggest reason that I do that with Caden is not necessarily because I know it's going to help him become a man of God, and it's going to give him a faith that lasts, and it's going to train him in God's ways. All that stuff is true. But the main reason I do that with Caden is because my dad did it with me. You see how that's a multi-generational thing? I still remember that time. Like, I loved that time. I mentioned to you I had a little brother. Every night, he'd be like, it's time for bed. And we'd run down the hall. I'd knock my brother down so I could get the book, pick the book that I wanted to pick. And I'd pick it out, and we'd read that story with my dad every night. And the cool thing is, I called my dad when Lexi was pregnant with Caden. He wasn't even born. I called him up, and I said, hey, Dad, you remember that set of Bible books that you guys used to have that we read together every night? And he said, yeah, I remember them. I said, would you by chance still have those books? And he said, I was hoping you would ask. Because he had kept them in a box. Now, it might have been up in the attic with dust all over it and stuff piled on it, but he had kept them in a special place because he was hoping one day I would do the same with my son. Multi-generational faith. Something as simple as that, passed on from generation to generation. All because I had an actively involved dad in my life spiritually. Once again, the Bible says it better than I could ever say it. We'll close with this verse. Here's what it says. Proverbs 22:6. It says, train a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not turn from it. So I don't know where you are today as a father. If you're a father, grandfather, going to be a father one day, I don't know where you are, like, leading somebody spiritually. Maybe today is the day that you need to stand up and come forward and make a commitment before this church and say, you know what, I know I need to do these things. I know it's going to be hard. I just need prayer. Like, I need this church of believers to pray for me, to help me do these things. Maybe that's the decision you need to make today. Maybe you're a father sitting in here and you've never given your life to Christ. And that's the decision you need to make, is to say, you know what, I'm all in, not just for myself, but for my kids, for my grandkids. Because the honest truth is, you're never going to be able to lead your kids somewhere that you have not been yourself. Okay, you're never going to be able to lead your kids somewhere that you haven't been yourself. So maybe you need to come forward and give your life to Christ for the first time. Maybe you're not a father in here, but something that was said today just got you thinking about your family and about your kids and your future kids, and you need to make a decision as well. Whatever that decision may be today, I'm going to ask that you would come forward and talk to me during this hymn of invitation we're getting ready to sing. So if you would stand up, let's sing this together. And if a decision needs to be made, please come forward.